Here we go. Sorry, this is the first, I'm teaching 2 4-hour lectures, and the week gets really long, so that's Friday. So if I'm even flakier than usual, I apologize. But yeah, so there was the meeting that was at Harvard, that it wasn't like Harvard itself, it just happened to be at Harvard, like this is at London. And, but anyway, they were about AI for good. And I sort of don't believe in AI for good. so then they asked me to speak. And so I decided, let's talk about good. All right, let's really talk about good, okay? And so we won't get to that. First, you might think, so I'm gonna start defining good, but if you've seen me speak before, then you might have an idea that, in fact, I want to start out by saying, what is intelligence? So before we talk about artificial intelligence, we just talk about intelligence. And you get all these people, they're like mystifying it and saying, oh, nobody knows, it's a great mystery. Like what? Words don't work that way. We have a word for a reason. It has definitions. This is a really standard definition. I was taught this as an undergraduate in behavioral science at Chicago. I was taught it in Edinburgh as a master's student. And it turns out that a century before I was first taught this, in the 80s, this definition was established by people thinking about how to compare different animals, how intelligent different animals were. So it's the extent to which you do the right thing at the right time, that you can respond to a context. And besides the fact that this was the definition that I was taught, the other thing I really like about it is that it makes it really clear for non-computer scientists like governments and politicians and things, that we're talking about computation. We're talking about a physical process, the physical process of converting information, the context that's all around us, the information about that into action. That's a physical process. It takes time, space, and energy, and there's consequences to that. So, I mean, literally, it's not so bad now, but a few years ago, people really thought that some country, if they invested enough money, would find the magic algorithm that was even better than deep learning. Some people thought deep learning was the magic algorithm, and they just needed more data. But anyway, either way, and they would suddenly be omniscient, and it would be game over. One country would have won, and I don't know what, it's like the end of Highlander. It's like somehow magically something should have happened, right? Because we've gotten down to only one, right? No, it's not like that. Sorry, that's an old movie for those people who are not old enough to remember the Highlander. Anyway, where are we? If you accept that definition, and I'm not telling you have to use intelligence that way forever, but just for this talk, I'm going to use that standard definition. There are other definitions, of course, but once we're using that definition, then defining AI is really easy. It's just all the intelligent things that somebody made deliberately, okay? And I'm actually, since we're talking about good, the most important thing here is that deliberate part, okay? So what does it mean for something to be deliberate? It means that you decided explicitly. Well, what does that mean, right? Normally, it basically means it's something you can talk about. Well, what can we talk about? There's an awful lot that, like, I don't know, I hate this part of the talk because now I'm very self-conscious. I don't know why I wave my hands. I have no idea. I don't know how I choose exactly which word. I have sort of a topic. I have an idea of how much time I have and where I'm trying to go. But I don't have like micromanaging control, certainly not over the little motor, the motor neurons here. Like, no way, I have no idea, right? So explicit is it's a sub part of our intelligence that we can actually have a conversation about. That was originally the definition of explicit, could you talk about it? Or declarative, that's another way to say that. And when I first heard people talking about like the declarative memory of rats, I'm like, well, rats can't declare anything, right? But there's definite correlates, which is why we also talk about explicit between human and animal explicit conscious behavior. Okay, so if we're going to talk about that, why on earth is there some parts of intelligence that, why can't I not stop myself blushing, right? Well, that thing about micromanaging the motor neurons in my mouth to talk is sort of a clue. I just mentioned that intelligence, it takes time, space, computation in general, including intelligence, takes time, space, and energy. And one way that we make that work, that we handle all that, all those costs, is modularity. So you break down an enormous problem into more tractable small problems. And if you guys are programmers, I don't know how many of you are, but then you will be taught this like very early. Yeah, you got to break it down and figure out the pieces. And my PhD was about how do you break down the problems of intelligence to build like a robot? And then also, how do you re-coordinate those modules again so you get coherent behavior? It's not just about breaking things down, right? So you can't make the problem even worse by having done that. But anyway, it doesn't tend to be that way. It does tend to be that we break these into little pieces and we get somewhere with it. All right. So deliberative conscious thought, you can think of that as a set of modules that's really useful for things like communication, innovation. There's evidence, you know, neurological evidence, it's not proof, it's just kind of evidence that supporting guesses, that the parts of our brain that we use for talking and planning and conscious explicit memory are the parts that, that mammals use for navigation, for yeah, I've been there before, I'm here now, how do I get there? What's the best way to get there without not just the optimal route, but also the safe route, you know? So being able to sort of combine memories together, and you can't do that with a detailed memory, you do it with very high level reference. I'm assuming you guys are programmers. Is that a wrong assumption? Or you got, there's some number, because I wouldn't normally go into this detail about representation to a normal audience.
I think there's a breakdown of maybe like 50-50, I would say. Yeah.
The programmers have to later explain why I was going on about high-level representations to the non-programmers after I'm not here anymore, okay? So, but basically, again, because of this tractability thing, you can't think of everything, but you can think a lot about a very small number of things. And so the part of your brain that has the consciousness and those kinds of things has these very small sort of pointers at more other kinds of information. And that's why, like in courts, the lawyers will try to confuse the witnesses by introducing new concepts, so that then they start doubting their own memory, because they've literally changed the memory when they do that, because there's just those little pointers. And so if you change the big concept, then the pointers don't point at anything. Anyway, details I don't usually go into, sorry about that. So as I sort of just mentioned, oh, this is perfect actually for the next bullet, that when we deliberate, when we think about things, that's built on top of heuristics. It's not that we could have ever proved everything down to the bottom, but we must have had some level of, some things come for free, some things are just the best guesses. Because again, it's about computational tractability. We don't go down to the most basic model. So yeah, you noticed here that I said that deliberate and conscious thought often is kind of slow. First of all, slow, and also error prone. Another kind of error that if you're in sports, they teach you how to do things slow and carefully and get it right. But then they say you have to practice it till you're not thinking about it, and that's right. You have to sort of combine the skills together so that you don't have to waste a lot of time, so that you can just pull them up quickly. And biology also does that for you. So there's an awful lot of stuff that, like, hey, we only have 2 hands. And so there's a whole lot of things you might do with 7 hands that we don't even have to think about, right? So that's also a kind of, these are all you can think of them more or less as heuristics, as good guesses. All right. And when I say evolved here, I'm not really talking about Darwinian evolution necessarily, but just the fact that you generate a bunch of possibilities and then you test. You don't necessarily systematically reason about everything down to the bottom. And when we see the kinds of disruptions and innovations that we've been seeing in, for example, the government in Hungary and Britain and Poland and America, then sometimes what happens is somebody tries something that literally nobody thought to do before. So this is not just something AlphaGo does in Go. It's something that humans occasionally just go into a space that nobody had inhabited before. And then all of a sudden there's like all this new stuff you can do because people hadn't bothered to put up a wall there, right? So if I'm going to talk about good, I think it's easier first to talk about autonomy, because we need to talk about what an individual can do, what individual responsibility. So when people talk about autonomy in AI, they're often really confused. Okay, they sort of say something like, well, we used to call an autonomous robot one that proactively responds to its environment. It doesn't just react. But then people say, oh, but you program. Oh, here, yeah, there's some noise. I'm sorry about the noise. Maybe I'll skip over that. But anyway, I've been doing this for a long time. Is the main bottom line of this slide. Also, because the person who invited me to this was one of those researchers that was working on that. But so what that slide was about, maybe I should go back and show it to you again, was that people were really excited about autonomous robots back in the 1980s, and I got to work with some of the people who first got robots to animal-like speeds by making them think less, by having that innovation of realizing that you don't have to understand the whole environment before you take a step. That was the important thing, you know, people that thought of like, oh, you don't actually even need to have very high resolution on your cameras. You just need to know where the floor is and then keep going where there looks like there's floor. You know, basic stuff like that, and animals are like that too. It's not just stupid robots. But people, for whatever reason, thought AI would be better than that, but it can't be. You cannot think of everything. It's physically impossible. So that was what was on the left, was me with one of those old robots. And on the right was a robot that one of my PhD students, who's now a lecturer at Bath, Rob Wortham, built. And another one of my PhD students, Andreas Theodoro, who's now a postdoc in Sweden, had built that visualization of the goal architecture, which I had developed. So it's like a collaborative three-way project, but you can actually see transparently exactly what the robot is thinking about. And so let me go back to that slide just so you can see that again. So this is literally an IDE for being able to debug the robot's intelligence. That's what we designed it for. But what we're using for here is to run experiments. And it turns out that if you expose that IDE to ordinary, you know, people who have no idea about robots, they don't get the right answer. Even developers still have trouble exactly understanding what's going on, but they get a much better answer about understanding how the robot's working and what it's doing and what its moral status is, things like that. So great side of research, and look those guys up if you want to find those papers. Or again, ask me on Twitter. Okay, so the point was that no one agreed. They're like, oh, but we programmed the robot. Well, you know, you teach children too. And not only that, but there's all this DNA, like I said, deciding how many limbs you have and what frequencies your eyes can see and all those kinds of things. But while I was looking for a coherent definition of autonomy, I found the best one that made the most sense was actually in international relations. So autonomy is the capacity. So this is like intelligence. It's not a threshold. It's a capacity for a political region to control what happens within its borders. And you might see where this is going, because obviously the digital revolution challenges this capacity, because all of a sudden distance matters less, because we can like move bits so quickly. You know, again, not for free, not instantaneously, but really fast. So we've changed the nature of property and we've changed the nature of distance. So what a surprise, governance is different. Okay, but anyway, so the autonomy is the capacity of a geographic region to control what happens to its border, and it's fundamentally entangled with security. So security is almost like, are you even your own entity? So in the limit case, another country takes you over, right? You know, like Germany takes over Austria or something. And then they say, we're one country now, we're this big German-speaking land or something, right? But there's other situations where, like, for example, the British came to the United States in 1812 and walloped us, right? We lost, but we teach it as if we won. But basically, you guys burnt down the White House. I don't know, because I have both passports now. So we guys burnt down the White House. I don't know. Anyway, the point was that after that, America capitulated and started doing more things like Britain wanted, after having been really cocky, after having won the Revolutionary War. They realized, like, oh, if Britain gets serious, we're in trouble again, and it's very costly for us, and it messes up our trade. So we better kind of collaborate with Britain. So we sort of lost a little bit more of our autonomy. We got into a special relationship that's kind of flipped now. But that was, Britain and America are not entirely autonomous of each other. Britain will never be entirely autonomous of Europe. It's too close, right? But the level of autonomy is the question that you ask. Oh, and this is important too. It'll come again. War is when you assault your enemy's institutions to reduce their autonomy with respect to yours. I wouldn't be at all surprised if in 100 years or even 50 years, people talk about right now as having been, or from 2016, having been a period of warfare. But right now we don't think it's war because there's no boys dying in trenches. But by this definition, it is, right? So I've sort of already said this. I can skip this slide. It's just pointing out that that there's this relativity between how autonomous you are, how intelligent you are. Okay. So as we all know, ICT can compromise personal autonomy because we can go out there and recognize in ways that nobody had been able to before who you are. And, you know, I wrote a chapter in 2015 saying, you know, I'm worried about this forthcoming American election, actually, because of some stuff Microsoft had done. I should have known since they published it, they weren't actually going to be that evil just then. But with the Microsoft Connect, it's sitting on your television and you can tell which advertisements people look at. You can also tell if they're going to get divorced. There's a huge amount of information that we're just bleeding into our environment and digital can pull in. Well, anyway, I also knew about the Facebook paper, and I was like, oh, well, that's funny. But I didn't realize that was the one that's actually going to pay off in terms of manipulations. But, you know, we can do that from the same thing that you had to go and get these, you know, 50 likes on, it was, what was it, like 50 or 80 likes on Facebook, and you could predict how how someone's going to vote better than their own partner could, okay? So like, you know, because it turns out this big 5 personality factors were pretty good indicators of voting decisions. And then they also tell you not only that, but how easy you are to manipulate. Okay, so you could target manipulations at people. So a lot of this stuff wasn't about convincing people to change parties, although there's like maybe 1 or 2% that you can change who they would vote for. But it's a lot about, do you go to bother to vote or not? Which in America and in Britain is a big deal. In Australia, it's a law that you have to vote, right? So that's really different. But in America and Britain, if you convince people that, oh, it doesn't matter which party you vote for because they're both against you, both of the big ones are against you, and none of the small ones have any influence, then you disenfranchise them, right? On the other hand, if you convince people that their wacko extremist ideas are actually held by the majority of Britons, you know, and just the news has been suppressed about that. And you can tell that because here you're suddenly in a cafe with a whole bunch of people that are like-minded. So that proves that you're in the majority. Well, it doesn't. It proves that somebody manipulated you, right? But that's the kind of thing that convinces you to then go out and be active and invest your money and try to help that cause. And this is, of course, a redescription of what Chris Wiley reported happened with Cambridge Analytica. Again, in both Britain and America, but not only there. The company that owned Cambridge Analytica, which I think was SLA, I'm terrible with names, but they've been working for 30 years. That was their job, to manipulate other countries' elections, right? We were paying to manipulate other people's elections, and then we freak out if people manipulate ours, right? That not cool. All right, so nobody wants to talk about this anymore. But go and look at what was happening. I mean, this was an amazing paper about how WhatsApp, which is not even supposed to be a broadcast social media, it's supposedly peer-to-peer, you know each other, blah, 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 totally taken over with bots and sock puppets. And you can tell because, you know, they didn't hide it very much. Like every 50 seconds, a new one, you know, pops up or something like that. So they were able to document the way that it was turned into a broadcast medium in this election. And of course, this is ongoing. All right, so just as there's violations of individual autonomy through the digital, there can also be violations at the transnational level. I mean, Elon Musk was just here in Britain. I'm in Britain, sorry, in Germany. I'm thinking of this British person again. It's nice to be in London again, if only for an hour. So he was just, you know, here, you know, great. He's putting a car plant somewhere where there's no jobs, you know. On the other hand, it's also where there's a lot of extremists, you know. I don't know, who knows, you know. The point is that you have to think about, also you should see Hamilton's great. But when you have a period with extremely high wealth inequality, that is highly correlated with political polarization, right? And we actually, oh, that's my next slide, I don't have to say that. So let me just talk about this, which is showing, this is a graph, it's an American graph, but it's similar in Britain. It's just easier to track in America because there's only 2 parties because it has an even more primitive democracy. So the measurement of polarization here is just like, do the 2 parties cooperate? And what you see is that there was this really high inequality at the late 19th century. In fact, you can read Winston Churchill from when he was still a liberal, writing about, like, he's just come back from some war, it's the 19th century, and he's saying, why is it so hard to govern? And we all think right now, these guys have so much money, it's so unfair. But they're all going, why is it so hard to govern? You know, the turnover in the C-suite in the last 20 years has massively ramped up. So people are saying, why is this so hard? Well, it's because of inequality. It's because individuals have too much power, and you just create more volatility then, right? And so what we wound up with last time was World War I and a financial crash, and then that was enough for the British and Americans, who, to be fair, were super rich at that time. That relationship was working out well, and they made this massive investment into the welfare state, imitating, incidentally, Germany, who'd already sort of started that in the late 19th century. But so this was the American numbers. There was this huge, enough of the elite signed up with the proletariat to make this thing called the New Deal and FDR. And then after 1945, we led into the Bretton Woods Agreement. So for about 20, 25 years, there was no more wealth extraction. So after World War I, we'd imposed wealth extraction on half, you know, that World War I was just random entropy. And then we imposed this wealth extraction on the losers. And, you know, sorry for people that have these strong sentiments about that. But anyway, the point was that we said, okay, no more of that. And unfortunately, it was re-innovated by, guess who, the City of London. New ways to do, you know, 25 years later, like in the late 60s, there was new ways innovated for wealth extraction. And you see that happening now in like Russia and Greece and Afghanistan. The countries themselves, their own elite, are extracting wealth and creating huge inequality and instability. So actually, I'll answer that question about robot taxes now, just because it's a good slide for it. You can't tax the robots, right? Robots aren't countable. If any law you write about trying to tax a robot, then I, as a programmer, am going to go and build robots that don't pay much tax. What you have to do is tax the people with the money. So I'm very much income used to be easier to measure, so we used to tax income. I think taxing wealth, in fact, I've done it in like minor models, but in fact, there's like economists have demonstrated in the last 20 years that it's much more stable, predictable, everything else to tax wealth, not income. It has better externalities. And it is now easier to hide income because people just say, oh, we're giving away our stuff for free. And there's like bartering data. But it's harder to hide wealth than it used to be, which I actually think is part of what people are freaking out about. Apparently, one of the reasons Putin really hated Clinton was because he thought the Panama Papers were personal, like that she was trying to discredit him in front of his people, and which I don't think that it was personal on either side, but who knows? But apparently, he thought it was personal. So this capacity where you're trying to stop people from money laundering and whatever, that's the rule of law, and that has to do with paying your taxes. So what we need to do is the organizations that are benefiting from the AI have to sign up to supporting the infrastructure that can give us a sustainable, safe, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, that can and cope with the problems like that we are going to have 10 feet increase in the seawaters because the Antarctica is falling apart no matter what we do, right? At this stage, we need to both compensate and try to cut down on emissions. So anyway, that's what I think about robot taxes. So I just said this already. So shrinking numbers of proportionally more powerful actors, of course, breeds entropy. It actually also probably breeds extremism, because these people with the money can't be bothered doing the messy business of politics, so they give it money to politicians, but then they need to know they're the only ones who gave so much money to that politician, so they need to get that politician to say something absolutely insane on television so that they know, everyone knows whose person that is, right? So that's probably one of the reasons it facilitates extremism during these periods of entropy. But anyway, this is all hypothetical. This paper hopefully is coming out this month, but I'm not sure. But we got pretty pleasant R&R on it. Sorry, that's revise and resubmit. So, but that can be terrible, but we had a friendly one. so hopefully it'll come out soon. But we think that why there was so high of inequality in the late 19th century was then there was these distance reducing technologies. So I talked a little bit about the job of government. I haven't really talked about this, but one of the jobs of government is redistribution. right? That's why I was just saying that we need to pay tax. But it's not just to pay tax so the wealthy have less. It's more about creating those institutions that create the safe environment. So it's doing sensible, you know, and the redistribution. So my theory actually is that the guy, my co-author, is like one of the geniuses in this field. But my theory is that this might be that whenever you make an innovation, a technological innovation that reduces the cost of distance, that just naturally you get fewer winners, right? If we were all actually in London and we all went out to a pub, we wouldn't go to the best pub in London because it would take too long to get there and we wouldn't all fit, right? But if we all go Google something, hey, we probably Google with Google. Maybe a few of us are like, you know, going and using something else for various reasons. But it's easier to have and you know, think about airplanes. There would only be Boeing because they fly everywhere, right? There would only be Boeing left, except Europe said that's not safe, and then they created Airbus, and now Airbus is better, right? There's also 3 GPS systems, I think. I think it's like China, EU, and America have GPS systems. We only need one, sort of, if we could all trust each other, but it's better to have 3, right? But economically, there's only support for 1. So that's sort of this idea that now what's changed is the digital more than AI itself. So yeah, the problems of inequality lead to regulatory capture, and then something has to convince us. And one of the reasons I go around and give these talks is to try to convince people that this is enough entropy now. Let's get back into the contributing to the public goods phase before we have yet worse entropy and more people dying. You know, there's a lot of people dying right now. So yeah, people talk about this great decoupling that happened in 1978. I think that what's really interesting is the great coupling that happened before. That was a decision. It was a policy decision. And I honestly think the problem was that people thought the entropy was being caused by Marx, that Marx came up with these dangerous ideas. And then when the Soviet Union plateaued, their wealth plateaued actually, and their economy plateaued. It was rocketing. It was coming from feudalism. It was rocketing up. And then it kind of plateaued in the early 70s because their system of government wasn't very efficient. You know, they're planning economies and stuff. So I think that's why in about 78 people thought, oh, we don't have to do that investment in redistribution. Let's start capturing the money again. The elite thought that. So that's my guess. Again, not everyone thinks that. But anyway, but what I'm hoping I'm expressing here is that if we choose to regulate, which costs money, we can fix that. Okay, so regulation is the means by which a complex entity perpetuates a recognizable version of itself into the future. You're saying like, I don't want regulation. It's like, what are you talking about? Of course you do. And cells regulate, you know, like biological cells, you know, animals, we respirate, that's part of our regulation. Regulation is the way that you keep persisting. What you're worried about is, oh yeah, I work on this. I'm sorry, I should probably take that slide out of this version of the talk. Sorry, that was another one of my former PhD students. But I work on regulation in cells too. But the point is that that governance is the subset of regulation that is explicit and deliberate, right? And that doesn't mean that it has to be done by governments. Again, any human organization does govern itself so they, you know, so they're going to be there the next day or the next year, right? So you do, of course, companies are self-governing, but that doesn't mean they aren't also governed by governments. And they may also be governed partly by, you know, civic societies and weird whatever it is that the EU is, and you know, things like that, right? So what is governing? It's you select a problem, you address it with resources you got from somewhere, and then you stabilize. There's 3 steps. And I actually think one of the problems now is also with the digital, that it's hard to, the main way you get people to stabilize is by distracting them with something else. And that's really hard when you've got everybody watching everything with Twitter or whatever. But anyway, you can say, well, can we trust the government to do this important thing? And the answer is obviously no. Of course we can't just trust the government, right? We actually have to make sure the government works. That's part of our job, all right? No, you can't trust governments. You can't trust big companies. You have to work to have them surveil each other. You have to surveil them. There's all kinds of, it's, you know, vigilance, it's a thing. Modularity is always useful though. It is useful to have a coordination between people who live near each other because we have a set of problems in common. Everyone in London is breathing approximately the same air and drinking approximately the same water, and they're exposed to each other's diseases, and they're exposed to each other's kids who do or don't get enough education, right? So it matters, and you have collective problems, and then you modularize out and say, okay, let's have the government sort out the collective problems, okay? And what's really interesting now with the digital era and with these large corporations that exceed, borders, is what is the way, how does that change what the jobs of government are? And to what extent are there other problems that will be handled by other civic organizations or by collections of countries or by private entities, right? So governments are currently the principal means by which we make it easier to ensure everyone does their fair share. But maybe that's going to be different, especially if you live in Myanmar or something. Maybe Facebook, who's controlling the internet, has some role to play in whether you have fairness in Myanmar. All right.
A quick question just on that. I've been actually quite curious. So, what are the ways that you verbalize or explain the relation between governance and ethics or principles? Because I think intuitively those two are bound, but in a sort of like explain like I'm five, it would be really interesting to hear your thoughts.
Okay. Again, I probably got too many slides, and I see there's like 17 things in the chat, so I totally don't. I want to try to motor through this before too long. But just quickly, normally I say I do the same thing I do with I just did that move with regulation and governance. I do the same thing with ethics. So ethics is the means by which a society holds itself together. And I think that the fundamental parts of that are who are the moral agents and who are the moral patients. So the moral agents are those that you consider to be responsible for what they do. And that's one of those things that people think intelligence means, that you're intelligent, you are necessarily a moral agent. And that's like one of those confounds, because there's lots of, you can find societies that do not believe that women are the moral agents. I mean, they have some kind of responsibility for what they do, but basically they aren't given like legal, for example, legal access or whatever. You can find societies where that's true, and you can find other societies, of course, where women are considered within fully equal moral agents. You almost no society would consider a baby to be a moral agent, but they do consider it to be a moral patient. Almost every society considers that keeping babies alive is important. Although not every. I do know about places where it's just like, it's really hard to keep all the babies alive. And so there's a certain amount where, well, not so much babies, but the small children are already sort of allowed to compete at the dinner table and left alone to, even within households. So again, it depends on what your resources are. And so given that there's so much variation in that fundamental part of ethics, I argue that ethics, as I said, is about societies holding themselves together. And then so the morality is the conscious part of that. So that, and again, you don't have, that's just a random label, but just makes it a little easier, so that governance is like it's a form of morality. Yes, it's a subset of morality that is applied to like larger institutions. Does that make sense? But yeah, it's very, very related.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I've just said this, so I can actually pretty much motor through this. I think I'm going to skip over the GDPR. If anyone cares, we'll go into that. I saw you nodding at least, and this is what I was just talking about, is that we have this question about what does this mean? But let me be clear about this one piece, this star here. One of the things we sort of agreed to, so Westphalia was like this idea of states that instead of like an empire kind of going out and diffusing from a city, which is probably more natural, to be honest, in terms of influence, we're going to draw up the map, and there's going to be these borders, and then whatever a government does within the borders, that's its problem, and we're not going to interfere. That was sort of the first cut. Now, in the 20th century, we came to this agreement that there's this thing called human rights, and that governments are responsible for protecting the human rights of anyone who happens to be within their borders. Right? It doesn't have to be a citizen, doesn't have, whatever, any human inside their borders. So the whole world is partitioned up that way. And so what I'm kind of interested in is, I think that sort of makes sense, that we need all the geographic space and all the humans to be somehow accounted for. But I also think there's this other sphere of influence, which is the sort of the corporate sphere, and maybe also this other like NGO sphere. also around the planet. And I want to understand how these different spheres are interacting and what their obligations are, not only to each other, but to kind of hold each other in place. There's economic theory that that the ideal situation, it's kind of old economic theory, that the ideal situation is to have a government and a bunch of mid-sized companies, and that they all kind of keep an eye on each other's level of corruption. But that's just not a realistic description of the world right now. So then what is? and the GDPR is an interesting thing, because right up until it was put through, I was talking to people from Google, and people, not just Google, Microsoft, these people kind of kick around. Apple is always stealth mode. You never talk to them, but anyway, they're kicking around, and they're like, "Oh, no one's going to do business in Europe." I'm like, "Yeah, right." And I thought something might happen, but I thought there's enough of us, we'll take care of ourselves. But of course, they were all there, like, from the first day. They weren't going to turn their back on that large of a market of rich people. That was nuts. And that just shows again that you can through coordination, which digital allows you to coordinate. You can have influence on these supposedly impossible to deal with alien, entities. So I do think there is win-win solutions to coming up with the best coordinated efforts, and that we do have a good chance of putting digital taxes through. Although there's been, and then the next thing was you have people from like Google and Microsoft and whatever saying like, what's really weird is that once you pay that penalty of getting the GDPR compliance, it's like easier to do trade now in the EU. It's like an API to 28 at that point, 28 different countries. It's like really nice. And I'm like, they're a trading bloc. I mean, I went to those meetings by the EU too. They worked really hard to make the GDPR actually make it easier to do business with Europe, right? It was actually to benefit European innovation and the economy. And yet the big tech are still thinking, oh, let's block the next thing the EU does. It's like, what, why? Right? Let's improve. I mean, the GDPR definitely has its issues, and let's improve on those. But you got handed money on a plate. Why are you trying to interfere with the next innovation? It makes no sense. Anyway, oh, I just said this off. Oh, yeah, I'm not going to talk about data right now. If you guys want in Q&A, you can say, "Oh, come back to that thing where you said data isn't necessary." Okay, but I'm not going to do that right now. Because let's talk about the interesting thing. What is actually good? And that would take me another hour. But I'm going to just again throw up some of these postulates like the one I just gave you. I think that the stuff that we tend to call good is things where we invest in the level of a public, right? So that we're doing things that are altruistic, we do things for others. And then we say things are antisocial if they don't invest in the public that we think they should have. Now, a lot of antisocial behavior turns out to be for a smaller or other society. So you actually find antisocial individuals paying a lot of penalties to being a part of a smaller group. And so I think, but anyway, even if you were only trying to take care of yourself, or your family, then you have to always trade off. You can't just give everything you have to charity. No religion says give us 100%, right? Because you're not supposed to starve, then the religion has no people, right? So the optimal trade-off is probably, I'll skip over that. The basic idea here is that different people have different assessments of how much to trade and will live different life histories, and societies do well out of that. So that diversity, even at this level, is good. And from this, I think we can understand what I told you before. Again, I'm not going to go into a lot of details here, but the basic idea is that if things are getting worse, if there's a drought, or the sea levels are rising, if the economy is getting worse and you're at the point where you literally can't support your family anymore, then you may go for taking smaller risks, which means working with people more like yourself, so you have a better idea what the outcome's going to be, instead of going for a higher payoff, right? And so we show that makes sense in a model. And this is the paper that we hope will come out this month, but I don't know. Anyway, you can find it in an archive if you want to read it, if you can't wait to find out if it's true or not. Like I said, we had nice reviews, so hopefully it's good. That's right. So anyway, again, good is an explicit concept that helps humans survive by investing adequately in their own society. That's my hypothesis. And then I'm just throwing this in, sorry, this is kind of random, but anthropomorphizing AI, I would say, is bad. because it tends to make you not invest in your human society, but rather find this sink that's actually owned by some corporation and then invest a lot of time in that. Okay. And so that's why I hate this AI for good thing. I don't hate it. Obviously some great projects have been done by that. But I don't want to say that AI is responsible. It's never AI that's responsible. It's makers, owners, and operators are. And one of the really interesting things we have to do is clarify whose fault it is when something goes wrong. Did the owner misuse it? Did someone hack into it? Was it developed incorrectly, right? AI itself is not accountable or obliged to explain itself. The point is that these are all things that developers are obliged to make sure that we can trace accountability through AI, right? So, and this is one of the most nutty things to me in some of the good AI stuff, is that value alignment. The idea, people believe that machines using machine learning could somehow figure out what would actually be the best behavior, and then will do better than we can. So they want to trap humans and stop us from doing anything but whatever the machines have determined is optimal. Well, I've already been saying from the beginning, you're not going to find a single optimal solution. First of all, it's intractable to find it, but secondly, those optimal solutions change with, like I said, ecological context. Is it a good time to invest in growth? Is it a good time to protect yourself, right? That varies. So what we want, I think the best thing we can do with AI is make it value aligned with its owner operators. So, and then we hold the owner operators, the owner operators, keep trying to improve ourselves. We keep trying to do better and find new ways and better equilibria, right? So AI should be made transparent, right? That is something AI can be. But as a design decision, whether you keep the records that make it clear why your system is working the way it is. I'm not saying document what every way in a neural network does. I'm saying show me the database that you trained it off of. Let me know how you decided that you trained it enough. Let me know how you secured the system. And let me know whether somebody paid you to make sure that Black people stayed in jail and white people got off, right? Or whether that was just an accident because you didn't think hard enough about how you gather your data. You got to be able to demonstrate to me that you were legitimately trying to do the right thing. That's called due diligence. Any other manufacturing sector has capacity to be audited for that. For whatever reason, software has evaded that. And most software, if you aren't an AI company, you probably have the DevOps, that you have those records, because you found out that, we found out in the software industry over the last 30 years, it's worth having that stuff around so you can maintain your own software and keep your company together. But that when people go and try to look for those logs in AI companies, they don't tend to save that stuff. They're doing really bad DevOps, and nobody knows why. Just probably they're anthropomorphizing, which is, as I said, a bad idea. AI should promote accountability. Again, you shouldn't trust the government, but in the digital era, we could know whether the government is doing the right thing or not. We could have access to that information. All right. So this is the kind of direction that we should try to do. There's no techno-determinism here. It's just that we have the affordances, we have new tools, we could make it easier to govern ourselves. All right, so let's see. I don't know how much time I have to, how am I doing for time? I could look at my clock.
Oh no, I think we're good for time. There's still 40 minutes. Oh no, there's 10 minutes actually. Oh. I've been enjoying it so much.
Stop and answer questions then. I'll just show you the slides. I could send you the slides. You can put them on your web pages somewhere.
Yeah, I think we can definitely share after the session the slides on the website. Yeah, for sure.
Okay. This is just the stuff about DevOps that I was just talking about. And actually, I think I'm sick to death of talking about principles, but partly because I think the OECD did a great job. And I'll just say that, yeah, that they are about these human-centered whatever stuff. But I also want to show you that the core of the OECD principles were largely influenced by the British principles. So you can feel smug about something, which actually originally came from trying to correct Asimov's laws to show that manufacturers are responsible, plus a couple of things about owners and operators. And then so these three are sort of similar to what the OECD came up with. But I do think that we were still slightly better because we emphasized justice and ethicalness rather than fair. Fair is hard, but just is something we can strive for. And the first one, again, coming from Asimov, was non-lethal. And the whole thing was human-centered. So it became the first one, but the whole point of the British principles was that everything should be human-centered. Okay. But the OECD have done this much more lovely and rooted in fundamental rights of the UN and everything. So I will say one last thing, which is what is bad. Do you guys know what this is? It's GDP, but what's doing the damage or the benefit, depending if you're Mongolia or not? I can't see if you guys are answering, so I'll just tell you. This is the impacts of global warming. And I just want to remind you that war is dismantling enemies' infrastructure so that they lose autonomy, right? So people who don't like money laundering laws, that don't like trying to reduce global warming, and I don't think it's the Finns. So in sum, good is investing adequately in society so that people can flourish. Regulation is a means of perpetuating entity into the future. Good regulation supports innovation by making a society sustainable. Making regulation and government better is a perpetual and necessary task. Updating governance when we innovate new technology apparently is also necessary. It's just part of the process. It will lag a little bit, but now that's what we need to invest in. And those of us with money and power would do well to contribute to the general public's good, including by paying taxes, but not limited to that, also using our brains. So thank you for your attention, and let's see what the questions are. That
was really insightful, Joanna. Like always, very, very much insightful. And if you look at the chat, I mean, the questions are so broad, diving into various different things. I mean, we have 5 minutes. I actually didn't even realize the time. I was myself extremely interested, you know, and I think I myself have a list of questions as well. But
I thought we were a 2-hour meeting, so that's why I wouldn't have done the 45 minutes here.
All right. Okay. Well, I think that's definitely. I'm sure each of the sections in itself could be a 2-hour meeting as well. So I think before maybe delving into some more detailed ones, you know, I think the people in the chat are very much either practitioners or individuals that are very much interested in the field, both from a technical, non-technical area. But if there was one or a set of call to actions that you could give these people, besides, you know, going and reading some of the papers that you're going to be publishing quite soon, what would be some call to actions that you could tell people that they actually themselves can go and contribute to the conversations or contribute to the ongoing projects? Yeah, what are those call to actions you would say? Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, helping people understand, like I said, not that we're saying trust government or give up your own independent internal regulation, but that we're saying understand that you can do things better by cooperating and getting together and building. You know, one of the things that I think people are really confused about right now is that it's great, you know, protests are great, but protests is not enough. They're too decentralized. It's a good way to indicate, to slow down what a government is doing, but the only alternative is provided through structure. And so people say, oh, we hate political parties, but it's like without a political party or some kind of structure, you cannot replace the power structure. It's complicated, it's immensely complicated. And people, one of the things I worry about was that both with AI and also with governance now, is that people thought the right thing to do was to make it invisible. It's like, let people just live their lives and let them not worry about, you know, like what, you know, government or that there's AI enhancing their abilities. They'll just like our products. You know, it's like Apple. They'll just like our stuff because they'll take better pictures and they don't need to know AI is helping them take better pictures, right? But when you hide that, then people don't see why they should pay for it, right? And I think that was part of the problem. And in Germany now, suddenly people go, oh, our government is worth something because like we're getting this great corona response and our hospital beds are empty and you know, and people are, they're less afraid now. They have more faith in the government. They're less afraid of disease. It's just amazing. Like the mental health is up because they're seeing a government that's responded well, right? So I think there's that we have so much more we can do, like I said, in terms of and it's not just about opening data and opening code, although that stuff is great, you know, well, with data, you have to be careful. But it's about having conceptualizing transparency is a thing you can drill down into. We're never going to make it so everyone can understand everything, but we ought to be able to show people, like, here's the top level of what this is doing. And then if you want to understand the next level down, here's like what degree you'd have to take or where you should go read. And so people can understand the penalties, the costs, and then make up for their minds. You know, in some individuals, hopefully will go all the way to the bottom and figure it all out, but not too many, because that would be a waste of, you know, 8 billion people's lives if we all spend all the time reading every piece of code that makes up, you know, Google or something. So you want to have is, so first of all, that we could all understand it and have something to help us build justified faith, you know, justified, not just trust, but justified belief in the reliability of various systems, including the government, including the news, things like that. But also, I think we need social mobility so that we all have a higher probability of knowing someone who does actually work for a tech company, you know, or who does actually has figured out enough how to read things or whatever. So that you don't want to have people isolated into groups where they have no idea what's actually going on over in that sector. So I think social mobility is a really big thing to emphasize too, that we need to get back to thinking about that again. Although Europe is, again, Britain somewhere in between, but Europe is now leading in social mobility, although they don't think they are. And America has fallen way behind in social mobility, although they don't think they have. And Britain's somewhere in between. But anyway, but there's a lot, and I don't really want to talk about Europe. There's a lot of the world that is facing a lot of, you know, like we're all unhappy about being locked down or whatever, but there's a lot of people that immediately lost their source of food. You know, there's 2 billion people were thrown into food insecurity immediately because, you know, they lived places where they were no longer creating their own food, or that just all the hard currency stopped flying through the air and coming to them. So yeah, we need to think on a large scale too. Okay, I see I have 13 new messages, and I still haven't scrolled down through everything else.
There's quite a lot of conversation going, and I guess as maybe some of the final questions. I mean, if people in the participant list would like to get more aware of the areas in this field of the intersection of technology, ethics, etc., policy, regulation, what would be the resources that you would recommend them to go and read? And, you know, feel free to also mention some of yours or others that could educate them. Yeah. Well,
you know, academics, we write these long, boring things, and then at the bottom there's lists of other people that have also written long, boring things. But ideally, we give credit to the shoulders we stand on. So, you know, pick up any paper, whether it's mine or someone else's. You know, well, I don't know. I don't think all papers are equally good. But if you're interested in my stuff, go to my recent publications are very much about this. But also, if you don't want to know all that level of detail, I do blog. So I microblog on Twitter, and I blog on Blogger. I might move it off of Blogger because, you know, again, you have to be careful about who your friends are, but at least who your perceived biases are. But anyway, but right, I write about everything, I blog about everything, but you can go, there's labels, so you can find like the policy stuff or whatever, whatever you care about, including I think there's that, it's like economics or something, if you want to see me talking about robot taxes. There's some good there's actually some pretty good blog posts about that, although they're a few years old now.
Awesome.
Changed that much.
No, I think that's fantastic, and to be honest, I mean, when I was starting to get into this, I guess intersection field, I came across a lot of.
Can I answer a question I really want to answer? Sorry.
Of course, yeah, please do. Go ahead, yeah.
There's this thing about the 400 principles or whatever. Again, the thing about the OECD principles, the reason I showed you those is because 42 national governments signed up to them, and then the G20, which includes China, signed up to it. So we've got, and the OECD are the guys, like all the GDPR and even our old data compliance rules came out from their think tank like in the 70s, right? So I think this is the way forward. And then there's this new thing called the Global Partnership for AI that was basically set up by the G7, but there's 15 countries in that. We got India into it, and Britain's in it. Actually, I'm on it as an expert because Germany, I've only been here 6 months and Germany put me on it. But they, so anyway, we are working now on trying to see this stuff come through. And I do think coming up with a coherent international digital tax is part of that. We do have to figure out, but it doesn't mean we have to get everyone on board. Again, we just have to get enough people on board that there's a big enough market that people want to buy in. But I think that it was the experience of seeing the GDPR that's part of the reason the US finally agreed to, it wasn't clear they were going to, but that they agreed to come to the global partnership. But that is governments, that is not companies and all that sort of had influence on some of the other partnerships we've seen. It's very confusing on the things that call us partners too. But I hope that the GPAI is something to watch and will actually help. Certainly the EU is already saying that every country in the EU should have its own local authority on the digital and AI. And so, and Britain has done quite a good job of this. Again, it's leading in that sphere, but a lot of countries are doing a good job on that now. So sorry to.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. No, that's. I think yeah, we can go a couple minutes further, and I think maybe what we can do is some of the questions that you find. Yeah, we can try to cover them. And I think for the ones that we can't, we'll share some of your resources. So I think people can, delve further into that and follow the conversation.
Well, I felt like a lot of the questions probably happened during the talk and then got answered in the talk, although it may have been people being confused. Sorry about that. I totally agree with the two, but let's talk about this most recent thing after all the nice people thanking me. You're welcome. This thing, the GPAI doesn't include China, and actually there was just an article in Politico that indicates that it was set up to deal with China, which I find a little disturbing because the OECD did have China in the room as an observer while they were working on that stuff. So I am slightly worried about what that means. But I can't tell you an answer beyond the fact that I care and I'm thinking about it, Charles. But coming back to this thing about the race to the bottom, yeah, not just the US. I mean, a lot of the EU is not following. It keeps being fined to not comply with GDPR, for example. But again, this is what the point of having governments and having treaties is about, that you try to specify what the costs are of not complying with the previous agreements. So, in theory, a government has enough power to enforce law within its borders. In practice, of course, law is a bit like a treaty, and not everyone is going to get penalized. So then you try to make the penalty high enough so that the probability of getting caught times the penalty is sufficient to dissuade people from doing the wrong thing. So that's how law works within a state. But between states, you don't have that same capacity to enforce, and so then you have these treaties that say, well, here's the penalty. But it's kind of the same idea. You say, well, again, you have to gamble, like, are they really going to enforce this penalty? So that's like the thing that we're now all trying to decide with Iran, right? Are we really going to enforce the penalties, especially when we've got like defecting on some of that? Yeah, thanks, David. Oh, hi, David. I actually know that person. I'm sorry, all the other people I do know, the names are hard for me, but monosyllabic names are a little easier. So I guess I should know who Margie Chef is, but anyway. But yeah, so let me see what Margie Chef says, actually. Some governments have come up with their own principles. Yeah, Singapore's don't look that different from the OECD's. But I think that, as I said, I think it's great to have, what people in Asia often say is that the European principles are too oriented at protecting individuals, whereas, protecting nations matters too. And just off the cuff, when somebody said, why is that? I was like, I don't know, maybe it's because people are much more likely to be killed by their own government than by somebody else's. So I guess we think governments can take care of themselves. And I don't know why that is. But anyway, so that's one of the things you see added in. So when there's extra principles in Asia, they're often about the obligations of individuals to the state. So maybe that they'll want to expand that. But I really think the OECD ones are a nice basis to start from, and the governments tend to protect themselves anyway. They don't really need to be given principles. Again, you have to think about the enforcers here, right? So they probably don't need principles to tell them to keep themselves going. Yeah, I don't know if that was an adequate answer, Margie, but at least it was sort of a wandering inspired by the question. Yeah, so do we need operational loops? Yeah, so yeah, no, exactly. So the point is that we do have some levels of governance. The GDPR is an example of it, and we need to keep innovating more. But it does have to be done collaboratively with at least large enough entities that corporations care about losing access to those markets. So. No, I don't think the principles have to be specific. I think that the regulations have to be specific. But you know, I used to think it was like people are saying, oh, what really matters is like dignity and flourishing. And you're like, what? You know, like, oh, that's like complete wishy-washy. But it turns out that that kind of stuff is sufficient when there's a sufficient travesty. So that all of a sudden, you know, infant mortality spikes, and you're like, well, people are not flourishing, right? And then you can, so when it's the level that you would want to have, you know, international intervention, it tends to be things that can cross those kind of very qualitative seeming thresholds. So actually one of those was the example of how, you know, it was decided in court and then nothing was done about it in Britain, that we demonstrated these terrible violations of our law, of our legal system, of our voting system. And it was like, so there, again, very fluffy sounding thing. People's data shouldn't be used in ways that they didn't intend. So this is pre-GDPR. That was one, yeah, like what does that mean, right? We didn't intend, you know. But when it came to like, oh, you used a bunch of likes of puppies and kittens and then manipulated my vote, okay, that was, you know, pretty much people were like, you know, that they were able to successfully find Facebook guilty of that, although then they could only fine them £2 million. Right, which is, so then they said, well, that's our maximum fine. Could somebody else please have with a higher maximum fine, fine them as well? Maybe the Canadians will still do our work for us. I don't know, but it's pretty weird to want Canada to do the prosecution for the UK. What is wrong that the UK cannot do its own prosecution? Okay. Okay. Well, anyway, even if I thought we had more time, I wouldn't mind cutting off at some pace and kidding, because I'm like, I haven't read email for 2 days.
I think I do have one question. I mean, I do have a couple. I mean, so I also, you know, didn't realize time. I mean, there's two things. One is more of just a point that you know, could lead into conversation. So the first one is that our next meetup, the topic is actually on Eastern and Western philosophy in the context of AI ethics. So a lot of the things that you're mentioning right now are fascinating because they are both contextual and will be discussed in the next session. I think the key question that was more of a comment, and the question that I did have is that when it comes to B2B in industries, it is possible to introduce standards. It's possible to ensure that players, buyers, and then suppliers, that interaction enforces at least a relationship where the buyer can force the supplier to comply with what often is referred to as best practices or standards, industry standards. However, when it comes to services that are primarily B2C, and you have things like perhaps the YouTubes or the Googles, often there is less of a push on that sort of preemptive standards and more of a reactive regulation. What is your perspective in ways that these best practices can be enforced in B2C services where the citizens or the individuals are ultimately at the mercy of the companies, because even in a national regulation, there is still international interactions of users that go beyond those borders. So what are your perspectives, and what are some ways to enforce those best practices?
That is a great question, and I also finally noticed the Q&A that there's two great questions there. So I'll try to do these, and then we'll try to end by what I would call 3 o'clock, what you would call 2 o'clock. Okay, so by the top of the hour we'll try to end. Okay, so this is something that this distinction between services and ordinary products is in the law. And I think you've just done a better job of explaining why that distinction is made in the law than most people I've heard. But this was one of the big discussions in the first draft white paper that on AI that the EU had commentary on earlier this year. And I think a lot of us have targeted that as a big part of the problem. And I'm really trying to convince people that it's better to look at this stuff. So there's two sides of it. One is, what makes it a service rather than a product? And part of that is that, again, it's this freeness, right? That the arbitrariness of the valuing. And I think so. I'm actually collaborating now with the European Commission, some people in the Director General of Competition, and helping us identify what anti-competitive behavior looks like. And I've heard that part of the commission really held up as one of the things that is helping the whole world be more fair, because they really, any one country, it's relatively easy to capture, not super easy, depends on the country, to capture the Justice Department. But when you have something that's done this hybrid that's serving 27 countries, it's harder, although I would say that there's scary evidence that it might be getting done, maybe not at the Director General level, but maybe at the, if you see some of the judicial outcomes that have been happening recently. So it is an ongoing struggle, but I think the European Union is showing a way forward. And I think one of the ways to avoid capture is to become even more agile. So yes, there's reasons for geographic regions to cooperate, but what if we could add in, like I said, okay, maybe Luxembourg and Ireland will never agree to this, but what if Indonesia agrees? And would that be a large enough market that if we could just have a collaboration between most of the EU plus Indonesia, would that be enough, and so would that still set the kind of standard, and then everybody else would say, oh, I want to sign up to that too. So I'm hoping that we can do that, so that those are the two pieces. But I do worry, for example, I don't think there's any way we're going to stop people from actually retaining personal data, right? It's just like, you can put it on a thumb drive these days, right? So I think what we have to do is we have to proactively have technology which is looking for evidence that a service is illegally predicting and manipulating the behavior of humans. And that can only be done, I mean, you can go and try to hack, a lot of this stuff now is being prosecuted by finding the email. And there was that incredible event in London where some guy with ridiculous clothing and title went and opened the door of a hotel and got some email that just happened to have been brought from America on somebody's laptop, right? But going to email shouldn't be what we have to do. We should be able to go out and measure some of these things, and that will take an effort. That would be an investment, and this is robots will not take all the jobs. There's an infinite number of jobs. But I think we will have to look, you have to do this stuff in aggregate, because any one thing could be a lucky guess. I mean, there was already targeted marketing, back in the 80s. You move into a neighborhood, people figure out, oh, you must be gonna have kids, and they would send you stuff, right? That you didn't need computers for that. So this is something that it's just gotten larger, and now we have to go back and say, what is a just amount of that, and figure out how to regulate that. And again, it makes sense to do that at a regional, globally regional level to think about these things, although local too can be quite useful. Okay, so yeah, no, I think it isn't. So those are the two parts. The one part was why are we even thinking of services as different from products? Can we stop that? And then the other thing is, how do we handle the minutia of having so many people that are violated, and the fact that you can only know that there's a violation if you look at it in aggregate. Okay, so I don't even know if Sunblock and David are still here. But I don't know what Sunblock is talking about, because Rail it decayed because it was outcompeted by air, but it hasn't entirely decayed, and in some places it's replacing. It has a very good chance of coming better. And oil was inadequately regulated. I think part of the problem here is we did not get on top of transnational regulation as much as we should. So I think the petrochemical entities have driven a lot of these assaults that we've seen that have disrupted our capacity to regulate tech. So we think like, oh my gosh, these biggest the companies are tech right now. But there's a lot of money in finance. I really recommend, this is something I recommended, Catherine Pistor's book about the Code of Capital. Super interesting. And again, weirdly, I mean, we speak English, whatever, so we think it's like this, but London and New York are like monopolizing like how you can get capital to invest and have companies. And that's part of why it's hard to control the defections that Trump has done because of the importance of New York for accessing capital. So that's a really interesting problem. But anyway, David's question, yes. But my point about the focus on deliberate is just that it's stuff that we can talk about, right? There's a lot of things we can talk about. With AI, we may actually get access to more things. We may have labels and categories for more things, and we may increase the number of things we can talk about. But I didn't mean the fact that I was focusing. All I was trying to do in bringing up the concept of deliberate was to focus on that people get overexcited about AI and like whole brain uploading and stuff like that. They aren't thinking about what is really being done with the machines and what is really happening with human behavior. So much of what it is to be human is the ape hardware, and there's just like these little bits that are these symbols that we fling around. It's like the opposite of computer communication. It's a very minimal part of the control. So basically, there is a really interesting question about accidental outcomes, and the only thing that we can do is we keep going out and again following best practice, learning and observing, and keep trying to find ways to recognize and limit those failures. I know that like people talk about flash crashes and it's this terrible thing. And I know they are disruptive, and it's a big deal. I don't think it's nearly as big a deal as like COVID, right? Not as many people are killed by them. It's not that big of a deal if a corporation, like all those people. It's not like all the people that had all that knowledge, they go work for other companies. It's not that big of a deal when corporations go down and come back up in a strong economy. So the amount of fuss that people make about flash crashes and various that kind of emergent thing, I think that's nothing compared to this acceleration of the impact of disinformation and of cross-border things. So those things have been slow, and now we need to recognize them and go back and tidy that up. But that's how governance works. We want to create a relatively stable regulatory framework so people can put together, families and businesses and things. We don't want sudden changes, but now we need to deal with both what the digital crisis and the climate crisis, and of course the pandemic. And hopefully we'll find good ways to invest money that optimizes all of those problems. That's one of the things the German government is talking about right now. When do we switch from investing money to stabilize the current context and instead invest money so that people move into the next context? Because we know the current context is unsustainable. So maybe we shouldn't, how do we selectively encourage people to transition to different sorts of occupations and different sorts of manufacturing? All right, so I'm going to say answer those questions, whether or not you guys think.
Awesome. No, I thought that was fantastic, and I think John, I think we could definitely go into 1 hour, 2 hour discussions for each of the for every 2 slides that you had in your presentation. I think they are extremely conceptually loaded and very, very interesting topics. Yeah, I mean, I like always, I'm very, very grateful that you gave us some of your knowledge and time, and really, really excited to see where this ongoing discussions that you're currently leading are going to continue to go. I think for all the participants, I'm extremely grateful that we still have quite a large number of people quite active still on the chat. So I appreciate everybody that joined, and we will be sharing some of the resources that Joanna talked about, even the book. I think I saw that somebody shared the Goodreads of the Code of Capital, but also for other resources like her slides. So yeah, I mean, and if anything else, we have the meetup group. So make sure that you can ask any further questions on that. And yeah, again, Joanna, thank you again so much. That was a fantastic session. And I don't know if you want to say any sort of like closing words from your side. Yeah.
Yeah, no, just good luck, you guys. You've got a lot of work right now in London.